Whispers at Elderwood. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The mist hung thick and low over the grounds of Elderwood Manor as Lydia Fenwick climbed out of her car, gravel crunching beneath her boots. The ancient manor loomed ahead, dark and imposing, its stone walls cloaked in ivy that twisted like tendrils of some creeping nightmare. Elderwood's towering windows reflected the bruised colours of twilight, and somewhere in the depths of the sprawling estate, a single light flickered. Lydia couldn't shake the sense that the house itself was watching her. Every October, Edith Lane invited their small circle of friends to Elderwood Manor, a tradition dating back to their university days. Once, these gatherings had been joyous occasions, filled with laughter and camaraderie. But as the years passed, Lydia felt the undercurrents of tension build, an intangible weight that seemed to settle deeper into the house with every reunion. Tonight, that weight felt heavier than ever, and Lydia could almost feel it pressing down on her as she approached the door. The door opened just as she reached it, and Edith stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the warm glow of the chandelier overhead. She wore a deep burgundy gown that hugged her tall, slender frame, her auburn hair pinned back in a manner that accentuated the regal angles of her face. But her eyes, those lively, mischievous eyes that Lydia knew so well, seemed dimmer, the spark dulled by something Lydia couldn't quite place. "Lydia," Edith greeted her, stepping forward with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She embraced Lydia briefly, and Lydia noticed the faint tremor in her friend's hands. "It's so good to see you." "It's good to see you too, Edith," Lydia replied, squeezing her friend's shoulder. "You look well," she added, though the statement felt hollow. Edith's skin was paler than usual, her movements slower, more deliberate. Lydia sensed a heaviness in her friend's demeanour, a burden she was struggling to carry alone. Edith led Lydia into the grand foyer, and as they stepped inside, Lydia felt the familiar yet eerie presence of Elderwood wrap around her. The high, arched ceilings seemed to loom even higher in the candlelight, casting elongated shadows that clung to the edges of the room. Portraits of Edith's ancestors lined the walls, their expressions frozen in varying degrees of severity, as if they were silently judging the gathering. Lydia suppressed a shiver as she passed under their watchful gaze, feeling an irrational sense that these silent witnesses disapproved of her presence. In the sitting room, the rest of the group was already gathered, their figures cast in warm firelight that flickered and danced across their faces. Charles Ashby leaned against the mantel, a brandy glass in hand, his sharp eyes flickering over the group with a hawk-like intensity. Charles had always possessed a disconcerting ability to see through people, to peel back the layers they hid behind and expose the raw, uncomfortable truths beneath. He was dressed in his usual impeccable style, his dark hair neatly combed back, his suit carefully tailored. Reginald Marsh sat in an armchair near the fire, his head bowed as he studied the amber liquid in his glass. A painter of some renown, Reginald had once been the life of their gatherings, his dark humour and infectious laugh a constant presence. But tonight, he seemed withdrawn, almost morose, his gaze distant, as though he were lost in some private reverie. Alice Thornton, Lydia's closest friend, sat on the sofa, her slender fingers twisting her wedding ring in a nervous habit Lydia recognised all too well. Alice had always been the gentle one, the peacemaker, but Lydia noticed a flicker of anxiety in her friend's eyes as she glanced around the room, as if she were waiting for something to go wrong. And then there was Lawrence Lane, Edith's half-brother, who lingered in the doorway of the library, his figure half hidden in shadow. Tall and statuesque, Lawrence possessed an intensity that had always unsettled Lydia. His gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes, something dark and troubled that made her skin prickle. "Lydia," Charles's voice cut through the silence, smooth and sardonic. He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Another year. Another gathering at the venerable Elderwood. Let's hope this one is memorable. Lydia forced a smile, though his words filled her with a strange unease. Charles had always been quick with a joke, but tonight, his humour felt laced with something sharper, something that hinted at old wounds festering beneath the surface. The conversation flowed, but Lydia sensed an undercurrent of tension running through the group. Edith moved about the room, her laugh a touch too bright, her movements almost frantic as she poured drinks and rearranged flowers. Lawrence stayed quiet, his gaze drifting to Charles every now and then, a look of simmering resentment flashing in his eyes. Lydia watched them all, her instincts alert, noting every glance, every smile that felt too forced, every silence that lingered just a moment too long. Chapter 2. The dinner table. The dining room was a masterpiece of dark elegance, its polished oak table adorned with flickering candles and vases of autumn flowers. The chandeliers cast a warm glow over the meal, their light catching on the crystal glasses and silverware, casting reflections that danced across the walls. The table was set with an array of dishes, each more sumptuous than the last, and Lydia couldn't help but marvel at Edith's attention to detail. It was as if she had orchestrated a grand feast, a celebration that felt both opulent and strangely somber. Lydia took her seat across from Lawrence, who looked even more withdrawn than he had in the sitting room. His face was drawn, his eyes dark, and he barely touched his food, moving his fork around his plate in silence. She wanted to ask him if something was wrong, but the words caught in her throat. There was an intensity in his demeanour that warned her to tread carefully. As the meal began, conversation flowed, but Lydia noticed the forced quality in their laughter, the tension that lingered in the air. Charles, ever the provocateur, seemed determined to stir things up, his comments sharp and laced with a cruelty that bordered on sadistic. "So, Lawrence," Charles drawled, leaning back in his chair as he swirled his wine. "How's the family fortune holding up? Still trying to keep your head above water?" Lawrence's gaze turned cold, his hand tightening around his wineglass. "My affairs are none of your concern, Charles." Edith's voice cut through the tension, her tone tight. "Let's not talk business tonight, shall we? This is supposed to be a night to enjoy each other's company." But the atmosphere had already shifted, the fragile veneer of civility cracking under the weight of old grudges. Lydia watched as Edith's gaze lingered on her brother, her face etched with worry. She sensed that there was something unresolved between them, a wound that had yet to heal. Halfway through the meal, Edith spoke up again, her voice soft, but carrying a note of determination. "Lawrence," she began, her eyes fixed on him, "we haven't had the chance to talk much lately. I was hoping we could—" "Not now, Edith," Lawrence replied, his tone clipped. He cast a brief venomous glance at Charles, whose smirk widened just enough to make Lydia's stomach twist. A heavy silence fell over the table, thick and oppressive. Lydia felt the tension in her own body, the way her muscles tensed, as though bracing for something to happen. She glanced around, noticing how Alice's hands trembled as she lifted her glass, how Reginald's gaze remained fixed on his plate, his face set in a grim expression. She felt as though they were all teetering on the edge of a precipice, each of them clinging to the thin thread of decorum. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew stilted, the laughter hollow, and Lydia found herself increasingly drawn to Lawrence's silence. His eyes held a darkness that was almost palpable, a sense of brooding that seemed to fill the room. She wondered what lay behind that gaze, what secrets he was hiding. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Lydia awoke to the sound of a scream, sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness of the manor. She sat up, her heart racing as she struggled to orient herself in the darkness. The scream echoed again, a haunting wail that sent a chill down her spine. She threw on her robe and rushed toward the sound, her footsteps echoing down the long hallway. In the library, she found Edith standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with horror. Lydia's gaze followed her friend's, and her breath caught in her throat. There, slumped over the desk, was Lawrence. His body lay twisted, his head resting at an unnatural angle, his face drained of colour. The sight of him, so still and lifeless, sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. The others arrived moments later, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Alice let out a strangled sob, clutching her chest as though struggling to breathe. Reginald stood frozen, his face a mask of horror, while Charles's expression remained disturbingly calm, his gaze fixed on Lawrence's body with an intensity that sent a chill through Lydia. The authorities arrived within the hour, their investigation brisk and perfunctory. They concluded that Lawrence's death was an accident, a tragic fall that had ended in fatal head trauma. But as Lydia watched them close the case, a cold suspicion took root in her mind. She knew deep in her gut that this was no accident. Her friend's reactions only deepened her suspicions. Charles, in particular, seemed almost too composed, his demeanour bordering on indifferent. Edith appeared haunted, her movements slow and deliberate, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. Lydia felt a sense of disquiet settle over her, a feeling that this gathering had been a mistake, that something dark had been festering beneath the surface all along. The police concluded their investigation quickly, almost too quickly for Lydia's liking. They were efficient, but their assessment lacked depth, attributing Lawrence's death to a tragic accident, a misstep on the polished wooden floors leading to a fatal fall. But Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The image of Lawrence's lifeless body haunted her, a man so full of secrets and shadows, now silenced forever. That night, as the guests dispersed to their rooms, Lydia found herself unable to sleep. The manor seemed alive with whispers, the creaking of the old house settling sounding like hushed conversations just beyond her door. She decided to take a walk, hoping the quiet would help her thoughts settle. The corridors were dimly lit, the antique sconces casting a soft glow that barely penetrated the darkness. As she wandered, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet, Lydia's mind replayed the events of the evening. There was something off about the way Charles had reacted, too controlled, too detached. And Edith's distress seemed layered with guilt, not just grief. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, Lydia found herself back at the library. The room was cold, the fireplace empty, and the air tinged with the scent of old books and lingering traces of Lawrence's cologne. She walked slowly around the space, her fingers trailing over the spines of the leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves. Her attention was caught by a slight draft, a cool breeze that seemed out of place in the otherwise still room. Following the sensation, she moved toward one of the towering bookcases on the far wall. Upon closer inspection, she noticed scuff marks on the floor, subtle, but there. It was as if the bookcase had been moved recently. Heart-pounding, Lydia pressed her hands against the ornate woodwork, feeling for any irregularities. Her fingers brushed over an intricately carved floral motif, and to her surprise, the panel gave way under her touch with a soft click. The bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. She hesitated only for a moment before retrieving a candle from the mantelpiece and lighting it. The flickering flame cast long shadows as she stepped into the secret corridor. The walls were lined with cold stone, damp to the touch, and the air smelled of earth and age. The passage seemed to run the length of the manor, with small alcoves and twists that made it disorienting. As she ventured deeper, Lydia's candlelight illuminated a small object on the ground, a silver cufflink glinting in the dim light. She picked it up, recognizing the engraved initials, C.A. Charles Ashby. The realization sent a chill through her. What was Charles's cufflink doing in this hidden passage? Further along, she found scuffed footprints and the faint scent of Charles's distinctive cologne, a blend of sandalwood and citrus that was unmistakable. The passage led to a narrow staircase that ascended toward the east wing, the direction of Charles's room. Returning to the library, Lydia replaced the candle and carefully closed the bookcase, ensuring everything appeared undisturbed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Why had Charles been sneaking through hidden passages? And what connection did this have to Lawrence's death? Chapter 4. The suspicions deepen. The next morning, over a subdued breakfast, Lydia observed her friends closely. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension, each person lost in their own thoughts. Edith picked at her food, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. Alice sat silently, her hands wrapped around her teacup as if seeking comfort from its warmth. Reginald avoided eye contact, his usual sardonic wit absent. Charles, however, seemed remarkably composed. He engaged in light conversation, commenting on the weather and the beauty of the estate, as if nothing were amiss. It was this forced normalcy that heightened Lydia's suspicions. "Such a shame about Lawrence," Charles said smoothly, sipping his coffee. "He was always a bit careless." Edith flinched at his words, her gaze dropping to her plate. Lydia felt a surge of anger on her friend's behalf. "Accidents happen," Charles continued, his eyes flicking briefly to Lydia's. "We must cherish the time we have." "Accidents can sometimes be avoided," Lydia replied evenly, meeting his gaze, "especially if there's more to the story than meets the eye." A flicker of something, irritation, crossed Charles's face before he masked it with a bland smile. "Ever the imaginative writer, Lydia. Always looking for a mystery." "Sometimes mysteries find us," she said softly. After breakfast, Lydia sought out Alice, finding her in the rose garden, absently pruning dead blooms. The garden was one of the manor's loveliest features, even under the overcast sky. Autumn leaves drifted down around them, the air scented with the rich aroma of damp earth and fading flowers. "Alice," Lydia began gently, "how are you holding up?" Alice looked up, startled. Dark circles shadowed her blue eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's all so unreal." Lydia hesitated before pressing on. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Anything that might explain what happened to Lawrence?" Alice's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her gardening gloves. "No, I heard voices in the corridor late at night, but the walls here are so thick it's hard to tell where sounds are coming from." "Voices? Whose voices?" "I'm not sure," Alice whispered, but they were angry. It sounded like an argument. "Did you recognize any words?" She shook her head. "Just muffled sounds. I was too afraid to check." Lydia placed a reassuring hand on her friend's arm. "Thank you, Alice. If you remember anything else, please tell me." Chapter 5. Hidden Agendas. Determined to uncover the truth, Lydia sought out Reginald next. She found him in the manor's art studio, a spacious room filled with canvases and the scent of oil paint. He stood before an easel, a brush poised in his hand, but no movement, his gaze distant. "Reginald," she greeted him softly. He glanced over his shoulder. "Lydia, come to admire my unfinished masterpieces." "Always," she replied with a small smile. "Though it seems your thoughts are elsewhere." He sighed, setting the brush down. "It's hard to focus after everything." She stepped closer, examining the canvas, a turbulent sea under a stormy sky. "It's powerful," she commented. "Reflects a lot of emotion." Reginald rubbed a hand over his face. "Perhaps too much." "Reginald," Lydia began carefully, "do you think Lawrence's death was truly an accident?" He was silent for a long moment. "What are you implying?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted, "but something doesn't feel right." He turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. "Lawrence had a way of making enemies, Lydia. He was involved in matters that could be dangerous." "What kind of matters?" Reginald hesitated. "Business dealings. Investments that didn't always follow legal paths. He approached me once, wanted me to launder money through the sale of my paintings. Lydia's eyes widened. Did you agree? Of course not, he said sharply. I may be many things, but I'm not a criminal. Did Charles know about this? A shadow crossed Reginald's face. I believe so. They had a falling out over a failed venture. Charles lost a significant amount of money because of Lawrence. Lydia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The pieces were beginning to align, but she needed more. Chapter 6. Confrontations. That evening, Lydia decided to speak with Edith. She found her friend in the small chapel on the estate, a quiet place adorned with stained glass windows depicting serene scenes. Edith knelt at the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Edith, Lydia said gently. Edith looked up, tears glistening on her cheeks. Oh, Lydia, I didn't hear you come in. I'm sorry to intrude, but I needed to talk to you. Edith stood, smoothing her dress. Is something wrong? I believe Lawrence's death wasn't an accident, Lydia said, watching her friend's reaction closely. Edith's face crumpled and she turned away. I was afraid of this. Please, Edith, if you know something, you have to tell me. She took a shaky breath. Lawrence and Charles had been at odds for months. Lawrence discovered that Charles was embezzling funds from a charity they both supported. He threatened to expose him. Did they argue the night Lawrence died? Edith nodded. I heard them in the library. It was heated. I wanted to intervene, but I was afraid. Afraid of Charles? Yes, she whispered. He's not the man we once knew. There's a darkness in him now. Edith, I found a hidden passage leading from the library. Charles's cufflink was there. Edith's eyes widened. Then you have proof. It's circumstantial, but it's something. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Determined to confront Charles, Lydia found him in the study, poring over documents by lamplight. The room was lined with bookshelves, the scent of leather and parchment heavy in the air. Charles, we need to talk, she said firmly. He glanced up, an eyebrow raised. Can't it wait? I'm rather busy. No, it can't. I know about your argument with Lawrence. I know about the embezzlement. His expression hardened. You've been busy, haven't you? Why did you kill him, Charles? He stood slowly, his demeanor shifting from casual indifference to cold menace. Be careful with your accusations, Lydia. I found your cufflink in the hidden passage. You were there that night? He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Always the clever one. Yes, I was there. Lawrence thought he could threaten me, ruin everything I've built. So you killed him? He left me no choice, Charles said, his voice low and dangerous. He was going to destroy me. You have to turn yourself in, Lydia insisted. And why would I do that? There's no evidence, aside from your word against mine. Edith knows. Reginald and Alice suspect. The truth will come out. Charles stepped closer, his eyes dark. Perhaps, but you won't be around to see it. Fear surged through Lydia, but she held her ground. The authorities are already on their way. I made sure of that before coming here. For a moment, Charles's facade cracked, a flash of anger crossing his face. Then he smiled thinly. Well played. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The police arrived shortly after, and with Edith's testimony and the evidence Lydia had gathered, Charles was arrested. As they led him away, he cast one last glance at Lydia, a mixture of respect and loathing in his eyes. You've sealed your fate, he warned. This isn't over. In the days that followed, the remaining friends tried to make sense of what had happened. The manor felt emptier, shadows lingering in every corner. They gathered one last time before parting ways, each grappling with their own guilt and grief. Edith approached Lydia as she was preparing to leave. I don't know how to thank you, she said softly. "You saved us all." "I only wish it hadn't come to this," Lydia replied. "Will you come back next year?" Edith asked, hope tinged with uncertainty. Lydia looked at the manor, the weight of its secrets heavy in her heart. Perhaps, in time. As she drove away from Elderwood Manor, the mist began to lift, revealing glimpses of the countryside beyond. But Lydia knew that some shadows would remain, etched into the fabric of the place and the memories of those who had gathered there. She resolved to write about the events, not as a story to be published, but as a way to process all that had transpired. The friendships that once seemed unbreakable had been tested, and while some bonds had been strengthened, others were irrevocably shattered. But amid the darkness, Lydia found a glimmer of hope, a belief that truth, no matter how painful, was necessary for healing. And as she turned onto the main road, leaving Elderwood behind, she carried that hope with her into the uncertain future. Epilogue. Months later, Lydia received a letter from Edith. Inside was a photograph of the group from years past, all smiles and bright eyes, with a note. "Despite everything, I choose to remember the good times. Perhaps one day we can create new memories untainted by the past. Until then, know that you will always have a place at Elderwood. With love, Edith." Lydia placed the photo on her desk, tracing the faces with her fingertips. The journey had been fraught with danger and despair, but it had also revealed the strength of her convictions and the resilience of true friendship. She took a deep breath and began to write, not just about the darkness they had faced, but about the light that had emerged from it. A story of whispers, secrets, and ultimately, redemption. The end. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Want to be the first to catch new releases? Hit the bell to stay updated. Thank you for listening.